It's August 26th, 2026, and if you rewind this entire story back to the very beginning, what you find is a moment that barely got the attention it deserved at the time. The moment Iran actually stood up and declared it owned the Strait of Hormuz outright. Back on March 2nd, the IRGC officially confirmed the strait was closed to what they called unfriendly nations, allowing only Iran-approved vessels to pass through. 2 days later, on March 4th, Iran's Navy went even further, announcing it had achieved what it described as complete control of the strait. Complete control of one of the most important waterways on the entire planet. That declaration didn't age well, because 5 months later, after a sustained air campaign, a full naval blockade running in the opposite direction, an emergency rescue operation for stranded commercial shipping, and the creation of an entirely new international security framework, Iran's claimed control over Hormuz has been systematically dismantled piece by piece, and what's left standing today looks nothing like what Tehran was boasting about back in early March. Let's go back to the actual moment this crisis started, because understanding how audacious Iran's original move actually was makes everything that followed make a lot more sense. This entire Strait of Hormuz crisis traces directly back to February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched their joint opening strikes against Iran, killing the supreme leader and a wide range of senior officials in that first wave. Iran's response wasn't just missiles and drones fired back at Israel and American bases. It was something far more consequential for the global economy. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps issued sweeping warnings forbidding passage through the strait entirely, began boarding and attacking merchant ships, and started laying naval mines throughout the waterway. Remember, before this war ever started, roughly 25% of the world's entire seaborne oil trade and 20% of global liquefied natural gas moved through that exact stretch of water. So when Iran effectively slammed that door shut and declared complete control over it, they weren't just making a regional military statement, they were threatening to choke off a meaningful percentage of the entire planet's energy supply in one move. And here's the part that made Iran's posture even more brazen. They didn't actually close the strait to everyone. Several Iran-approved ships continued passing through during this period, mostly petroleum tankers bound for China and India, some of them even receiving military escort from Iran's own navy. So the real message being sent wasn't, we're closing this waterway for safety reasons. It was, we now decide who gets to use this waterway and who doesn't. And if you're a country or a company we consider friendly, you keep getting your oil. And if you're not, good luck. Iran even threatened to set fire to any other ship that dared pass through without their approval, an explicit public threat against international commercial shipping that should have set off alarm bells everywhere from Wall Street to Brussels the moment it was made. President Trump's initial response, delivered on March 12th, set the tone for everything that would follow over the coming months. He made clear the United States viewed Hormuz as an international waterway, not something any single country, including Iran, gets to unilaterally control or restrict based on political loyalty. But rhetoric alone wasn't going to reopen a strait that Iran had mined and was actively enforcing with naval patrols and the threat of burning ships alive on the water. So a week later, on March 19th, the United States formally launched what would become known as the Strait of Hormuz campaign, a dedicated aerial operation specifically targeting Iranian naval vessels and drones, executed by the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, and the Israeli Air Force working in coordination, with one explicit singular goal: physically reopening that strait by destroying the assets Iran was using to enforce its claimed control over it. That campaign has now been running for more than 4 months straight, and it's produced some of the most significant individual strikes of this entire war. Israel's Air Force specifically targeted and killed Alireza Tangsiri, the Iranian naval officer personally overseeing the strait blockade operation, a decapitation strike aimed directly at the command structure responsible for enforcing Iran's grip on Hormuz. Removing the specific commander running that operation wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was designed to create genuine confusion and disruption in exactly the chain of command Iran needed functioning smoothly to keep threatening international shipping in a coordinated, sustained way. Let's rewind through the middle chapters of this fight, because the sequencing shows just how methodically the United States worked to unwind Iran's control over the strait piece by piece. Less than a month after that campaign began, on April 13th, following the collapse of the Islamabad talks that had been meant to end this entire war diplomatically, the United States flipped the entire dynamic on its head and imposed its own naval blockade, not against international shipping trying to use the strait, but specifically against Iranian ports and Iranian coastal areas themselves. That blockade was commanded through Donald Trump, with Admiral Brad Cooper running United States Central Command and Admiral Samuel Paparo overseeing broader Indo-Pacific coordination. And it was executed jointly by the United States Navy and Air Force with one explicit target: blocking vessels from entering or leaving Iranian ports at all. The financial results of that first blockade phase were staggering almost immediately. On April 22nd, President Trump publicly claimed the blockade was costing Iran $500 million every single day. The Department of Defense's own independent assessment, released shortly after, estimated that by May the 1st, just over 2 weeks into the blockade, Iran had already lost $4.8 billion in oil revenue. $4.8 billion? Gone in roughly 18 days. That's the kind of number that doesn't just hurt a government's balance sheet. It starts directly undermining a regime's ability to fund literally everything else. It depends on, from military operations to basic government functions to whatever subsidies it uses to keep its own population from revolting entirely. And right in the middle of all that financial pressure, Iran actually blinked, at least temporarily. On April 17th, just 4 days after the American blockade began, Iran announced that its own closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the one that had been in place continuously since the war's opening days back on February 28th, would be paused for the duration of a separate truce that had just been reached in Lebanon, with Tehran claiming passage of commercial vessels through the strait would now be completely open. That announcement is worth sitting with for a moment because it represents Iran publicly backing away from the exact complete control claim it had been making since early March, just weeks after making it, directly in response to the economic pain the American blockade was inflicting in return. But claiming an open strait and actually delivering one turned out to be two very different things. And 2 days later, on April 19th, the first direct enforcement action of the American blockade actually took place, involving the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit intervening against vessels attempting to move through Iranian waters. From there, the blockade kept grinding forward through the following weeks. And by early May, with commercial shipping still facing severe restrictions and countless vessels either stuck indefinitely or physically unable to move at all, the United States launched Operation Project Freedom on May 4th, a dedicated Navy mission running through May 6th, specifically designed to escort stranded merchant ships safely out of the Gulf entirely. Think about what that operation actually represented in practice. The United States Navy running an active military evacuation for civilian oil tankers, treating global commercial shipping the way you treat refugees needing safe passage out of a war zone. Because at that specific moment, functionally, that's exactly what these vessels and their crews had become. That first blockade phase eventually wound down on May 29th, coinciding with renewed diplomatic momentum that eventually produced a memorandum of understanding in mid-June, establishing a 60-day ceasefire framework meant to genuinely stabilize the situation. For a few weeks, it looked like this entire saga might actually be winding towards some kind of durable resolution. That illusion didn't survive long. The language in that MOU covering the strait was deliberately vague, requiring only that Iran use its best efforts for safe passage of commercial vessels, with no charge for 60 days only, leaving the door open for Iran to potentially reintroduce fees or restrictions down the road. Iran interpreted that ambiguity exactly the way you'd expect. As confirmation, it still retained some degree of control over access to the strait, and within about a week of the deal being signed, Iran launched a drone strike against a commercial ship transiting Hormuz, an attack the United States immediately treated as a direct ceasefire violation. That set off a familiar, unstable cycle over the following weeks, contained Iranian provocations against shipping, met with limited American retaliatory strikes, followed by Iranian counterstrikes against American Gulf allies like Bahrain and Kuwait, until everything finally exploded on July 7th, when Iran attacked 3 separate commercial vessels in the strait in a single day. The United States response this time wasn't limited or contained. It was described by one unnamed official as punishment strikes, hitting more than 80 separate Iranian targets in one coordinated wave. Speaking at the NATO summit in Ankara the following day, Trump declared the ceasefire completely over, and less than a week after that, on July 13th, the United States formally reimposed its naval blockade against Iranian ports for a second time, going into effect the following day at 4 p. Hemisphere Eastern, with an official Navy statement warning all neutral vessels to depart the blockaded area before enforcement began. Let's talk about how much bigger and more deliberate this second blockade phase has been compared to the first, because the scale genuinely matters here, and understanding just how much larger this response was compared to the spring phase tells you exactly how seriously Washington had come to treat Iran's repeated violations by the time July arrived. As of the most recent CENTCOM reporting, more than 20 United States Navy warships and hundreds of military aircraft are currently operating across the Middle East theater, with American forces described in official statements as vigilant, lethal, and ready. Since this second blockade phase began, 85 vessels have been intercepted attempting to move to or from Iranian ports. 3 ships have been fully seized outright. And while Lloyd's List, the independent global shipping tracker, estimates roughly 26 vessels have still managed to bypass the blockade, despite everything the Navy has thrown at this operation, the overwhelming majority of Iranian maritime traffic is now either being stopped, redirected, or seized. The financial toll has been just as brutal as the first round. with the United States estimating this renewed blockade is costing Iran roughly $500 million every single day, on top of the $4.8 billion already documented lost during the first blockade phase back in the spring. Iran hasn't taken any of this quietly. In direct retaliation for the American seizures, Iran has captured 2 cargo ships of its own, leaning on exactly the kind of hostage-taking on the water tactic it's used for years whenever it feels genuinely cornered. And the Treasury Department has been running its own parallel financial offensive throughout this exact period, with the Office of Foreign Assets Control specifically targeting what it's called the Shamkhani Network, an illicit shipping and sanctions evasion operation tied to Mohammad Hossein Shamkhani, described by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent as one of the Iranian regime's most profitable engines. Disrupting that specific network represents a direct attack on one of the last remaining channels Iran has been using to route oil sales and revenue around the broader sanctions and blockade pressure, essentially closing off yet another escape valve Tehran had been relying on to keep some money flowing, despite everything else collapsing around it. Let's talk about the global energy market ripple effects of this entire saga, because none of this has happened in isolation from the rest of the world's economy. Every time this crisis has escalated, whether it was Iran's original closure declaration back in March, the reimposed blockade in July, or the 80-plus target strikes that followed Iran's attack on 3 tankers on July 7th, the effects have shown up almost immediately in Brent crude prices, in war risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the strait, and in tanker charter rates that have spiked by as much as 40% during the most acute phases of this conflict. The International Monetary Fund's own growth forecasts have been repeatedly revised in response to this exact crisis, with global growth projections shifting up and down depending on whether the strait looked like it was heading towards stability or renewed conflict in any given month. Germany, heavily dependent on energy imports that historically move at least partly through Gulf shipping routes, has been described by economists as one of the most exposed developed economies to every single twist in this saga, watching its own recovery trajectory rise and fall almost in lockstep with whether Hormuz looked open or closed in a given week. That's the broader lesson sitting underneath all of the military statistics here. A fight over control of a 20-mile wide strait between Iran and Oman has had measurable documented effects on inflation, interest rate expectations, and economic growth forecasts on the other side of the planet, which is exactly why breaking Iran's claimed control over that waterway has mattered so much beyond just the regional military balance. There's also a significant political fallout dimension worth exploring here, because Iran's failure to actually enforce the complete control it announced back in March has had consequences reaching well beyond the immediate financial losses. Domestically, Iran was already dealing with a serious economic crisis before this war even began, with inflation running above 40% and mass protests carrying explicit anti-government sentiment breaking out in the months prior. Watching the regime's signature claim of dominance over Hormuz get systematically dismantled, first through direct military defeat of the naval forces enforcing it, then through a punishing counter-blockade that drained billions from government coffers, has almost certainly deepened the exact kind of public skepticism about regime competence that fueled those earlier protests in the first place. Senior Iranian officials involved in the diplomatic track with Washington have reportedly framed continued negotiations specifically around delivering economic relief to a suffering population, an implicit acknowledgement that the Strait strategy, whatever strategic logic it carried on paper, has ended up costing ordinary Iranians far more than it ever delivered in actual leverage over Washington or Tel Aviv. Here's an analogy that actually captures the full arc of this entire saga pretty well. Picture someone walking into a business they don't own, changing all the locks, and announcing to every regular customer that, from now on, only people they personally approve of get to walk through the front door. Everyone else gets turned away, or worse. That's essentially what Iran did to the Strait of Hormuz back in early March, declaring complete control over a waterway that never belonged to them in the first place, deciding unilaterally who got access and who didn't. And what's happened since then is the actual owners of that business, in this case the broader international community, relying on that strait for a quarter of the world's oil trade, systematically taking the locks back, first by destroying the people enforcing the new rules, then by literally blockading the original locksmith's own supply chain until they couldn't afford to keep changing locks anymore, then by physically escorting the regular customers back through the door, whether the self-appointed gatekeeper liked it or not. Let's talk about one of the most significant and least discussed outcomes of this entire crisis, because it might actually end up being the most consequential long-term result of everything that's happened: the formation of the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. This entire 5-month saga has produced a genuinely unprecedented shift in how security and shipping coordination through Hormuz gets managed going forward, moving away from a system where any single regional power, in this case Iran, could unilaterally declare control and threaten to burn ships that didn't comply, towards something resembling an internationally coordinated authority overseeing passage through the strait. If that framework actually takes hold as a lasting institution rather than just a wartime improvisation, it represents one of the most significant structural changes to how this critical waterway functions in decades, permanently reducing the leverage any single country, Iran specifically, could hope to exercise over global energy markets simply by controlling geography. And there's an important detail worth highlighting about how Trump specifically tried to position American involvement going forward, too, because it shows how seriously Washington has been taking this idea of establishing a permanent security role in that waterway, rather than treating this as a temporary military operation. At one point, Trump announced the United States would be, from that point forward, known as the guardian of the Hormuz Strait, and initially proposed charging a 20% reimbursement fee on all cargo shipped through the strait in exchange for providing that security. That specific proposal didn't survive long, generating immediate pushback from shipping industry stakeholders and economic analysts who pointed out that a direct 20% toll on global cargo moving through one of the world's busiest waterways would create exactly the kind of inflationary shock the global economy could least afford in the middle of an already volatile period. Trump reversed course within about a day, announcing the fee would instead be replaced by trade and investment deals that Gulf states would be making directly into the United States, a face-saving pivot that still achieved the underlying goal, tying American security guarantees to tangible economic benefit without triggering the kind of immediate market backlash a blunt shipping tax would have caused. Let's get into the actual hardware sitting behind these numbers for a moment, because more than 20 Navy warships and hundreds of aircraft represents an enormous, sustained concentration of capability that doesn't happen by accident. That kind of surface fleet presence typically includes guided missile destroyers and cruisers running the Aegis combat system, giving the entire force a networked, shared picture of every surface, air, and potential subsurface threat across the theater simultaneously. Exactly the kind of integrated awareness needed to intercept 85 separate vessels without a single major incident escalating into something far worse. Maritime patrol aircraft have almost certainly been running continuous sweeps for the exact kind of naval mines Iran laid throughout the strait during the earliest phase of this crisis, while carrier-based and land-based fighter aircraft have provided the kind of persistent combat air patrol coverage needed to keep Iranian fast attack boats and coastal missile batteries from threatening the blockade force directly. And underneath all of that visible hardware sits an enormous logistics operation. Tankers refueling aircraft mid-flight, maintenance crews turning ships and jets around for the next patrol, munitions and fuel being moved into theater fast enough to sustain a presence this size for months on end without the kind of readiness gaps that would give Iran an opening to slip more vessels through than the 26 Lloyd's List has already documented bypassing the blockade. There's also an important piece of this story involving who's actually still finding ways to move Iranian oil despite all of this pressure, because that relationship determines just how effective the American counter-blockade has genuinely been in practice. China has remained by a wide margin the largest buyer of Iranian crude throughout this entire crisis, often relying on a shadow fleet of tankers using ship-to-ship transfers far out at sea, falsified documentation, and flags of convenience specifically designed to obscure the true origin of the cargo, and slip past exactly the kind of interdiction operation currently running in the Gulf. Every one of those 85 interceptions and 3 outright seizures represents a direct hit against that shadow trade network, forcing both Chinese buyers and Iranian exporters to accept greater risk, higher evasion costs, and longer delays getting crude to market. But as long as China continues seeing enough strategic value in keeping at least some Iranian oil flowing, Tehran retains a partial financial lifeline even under blockade conditions this severe. That's precisely why this counter-blockade needed to be this large and this sustained rather than a token gesture. And it's also why the Treasury Department's parallel action against the Shamkhani sanctions evasion network matters just as much as the military interdiction itself, because closing off the financial plumbing that makes shadow fleet sales possible in the first place is often more effective at draining a regime's usable revenue than physically stopping every single tanker on the water. There's one more regional dimension worth folding into this picture before wrapping up. And that's how Iran's neighbors across the Gulf have responded to watching this entire saga unfold right off their own coastlines. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Oman all depend just as heavily on that strait remaining open and stable as any country buying oil on the other end of the supply chain. And every one of them has had to navigate this crisis with a mixture of relief that the United States has been willing to commit this level of sustained force to reopening it, and genuine nervousness about what a prolonged, high-intensity military presence sitting directly in their own territorial waters might mean if this standoff ever tips into something even larger. That's part of why Trump's eventual pivot toward Gulf states making trade and investment deals into the United States, rather than simply paying a direct shipping toll, mattered so much diplomatically, It gave those regional partners a way to actively buy into the cost of maintaining this security presence rather than simply hosting it passively, tying their own economic interests directly to the success of the counter-blockade, and, by extension, to whatever comes next as the Persian Gulf Strait Authority framework continues taking shape. Let's talk honestly about the human and commercial cost sitting underneath all of these numbers and policy shifts, because this crisis has never been purely abstract. Throughout the entire Strait of Hormuz crisis, at least one tugboat has been sunk, more than 17 merchant ships have sustained damage. With 7 of those so severely hit, they had to be fully abandoned. 2 merchant ships were captured outright, and 12 seafarers have been killed or gone missing across these incidents. A port worker in Bahrain was killed and 2 others wounded in a related attack. These aren't abstract casualties in a geopolitical chess match. These are real commercial sailors, often from countries with no direct stake in this war at all, caught in the crossfire of a fight between Tehran and Washington over who controls access to a waterway they were simply trying to move cargo through. Let's zoom out to the bigger strategic picture here, because that's really where the true significance of everything that's happened since March lives. Iran's entire strategy, going back decades, has rested on the assumption that geography gives it inherent, durable leverage over one of the world's most important choke points. Leverage that could be activated whenever Tehran needed to extract concessions or deter outside pressure. That assumption got tested more directly and more publicly in 2026 than at almost any point in the Islamic Republic's history, when Iran actually attempted to formalize that leverage by declaring outright complete control over the strait back in early March. And what followed was a methodical, multi-phase dismantling of that claimed control. An aerial campaign specifically targeting the naval assets enforcing it. The assassination of the commander running the operation. An American counter-blockade specifically designed to make continuing that posture financially unbearable. An emergency rescue operation proving international shipping could move safely even against Iran's stated wishes. And now the emergence of an entirely new international framework, specifically designed to make sure no single country can ever again unilaterally declare the kind of complete control Iran claimed back in March. That's really the story underneath the headline here. Not just individual airstrikes or individual blockade statistics, but a genuine structural unwinding of Iran's most significant strategic asset over the course of a single brutal year. Every single time Iran has tried to reassert some version of that original control, launching a drone strike against a tanker right after signing the June MOU, striking 3 vessels in a single day on July 7th, capturing cargo ships in retaliation for American seizures, the response has escalated in direct proportion. And each escalation has left Iran's actual functional control over that waterway measurably weaker than it was before. The complete control Iran's Navy proudly announced achieving back on March 4th simply does not exist anymore in any meaningful, enforceable sense, replaced instead by a heavily contested waterway, where Iran can still cause disruption and inflict real damage on individual ships, but can no longer credibly claim to be the one deciding who gets to use it. What do you think happens to Iran's position in that strait from here? Does the emergence of a formal Persian Gulf Strait Authority actually stick as a lasting institutional check on Iran's ability to threaten shipping going forward? Or does this framework quietly fade once global attention moves on to whatever comes next in this war? Do you think Iran ever manages to reassert any real version of the control it claimed back in March? Or has that ship, quite literally, already sailed for good, leaving Tehran with a much smaller, much more contested version of the leverage it once believed it could count on indefinitely? Let me know what you think in the comments, because between the $4.8 billion lost in just the first blockade phase, the additional $500 million a day being lost right now, and the sheer scale of naval and air power currently sitting in that theater, this might genuinely be one of the most consequential shifts in Middle Eastern maritime security in decades, one that future analysts may end up studying as the moment a regional power's claim to control a global choke point was decisively broken rather than merely contested. If breakdowns like this connecting the full arc of this crisis together are useful to you, go ahead and like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next update. Because with more than 20 warships still actively enforcing this blockade and the Persian Gulf Strait Authority framework still taking shape in the background, there's a very good chance the next major development in this story lands sooner than most people expect right now. Share this with anyone trying to understand how a waterway Iran once claimed complete control over ended up this thoroughly contested just months later, because the full timeline here, from that original March 4th declaration all the way through to today's blockade numbers, tells a story that individual headlines about single strikes or single tanker attacks simply can't capture on their own. A story about how quickly geographic leverage can evaporate once the country trying to weaponize it discovers that the rest of the world, and specifically the United States military, is both willing and able to make holding on to that leverage far more costly than it's worth. Let's dig a little deeper into why this specific waterway has always mattered so much strategically, because understanding the geography helps explain why both sides have been willing to commit this much military and financial resource to controlling it, and why a fight over 20 miles of water has managed to move global oil prices, insurance markets, and even interest rate expectations at the Federal Reserve. The Strait of Hormuz sits at its narrowest point just barely over 20 miles wide, with the actual navigable shipping channels on either side even narrower than that, meaning any country with enough coastal missile batteries, mines, and fast attack boats can genuinely threaten to disrupt traffic through it, even without possessing a conventional navy capable of matching the United States ship for ship. That's precisely why Iran's original strategy made a kind of brutal sense on paper. You don't need to defeat the American Navy in open water to threaten global oil supply. You just need to make transiting a 20-mile-wide choke point expensive and dangerous enough that shipping companies start rerouting or simply refuse to sail. And for a period earlier this year, that strategy actually worked, with shipping firms suspending operations in the strait entirely rather than risk their vessels and crews against active mining and armed boarding parties. But that same narrow geography that made Iran's initial threat so effective also made it enormously vulnerable to exactly the kind of concentrated air power the United States and Israel eventually brought to bear against it. A 20-mile-wide choke point is also a 20-mile-wide kill box for anyone with the kind of persistent aerial surveillance and precision strike capability needed to systematically hunt down every mine-laying vessel, every fast attack boat, and every coastal radar installation supporting Iran's control of that space. That's ultimately the strategic trade-off Iran made back in early March without fully appreciating the consequences, trading a threat that worked brilliantly against civilian shipping companies for a direct, sustained confrontation with the most powerful combined air and naval force in the region, a confrontation that's now stretched on for more than 4 months and cost Iran, by the most conservative estimates available, well over $5 billion in lost oil revenue alone, before even counting the military hardware, personnel, and broader economic damage absorbed along the way.